I'm going to show you how to make the pattern for your fabric. Now, some of the things that you will need: weights. I have weights because we're going to trace it on our pattern paper. French curve if you have it. Paper scissors. Remember to not use your good scissors. Clear plastic ruler, your notcher if you have it, and then something to trace around. Now for me, I'm going to use a Sharpie so that it's easier for you to see. Then of course you need pattern paper or a paper bag, whichever one that you have. So I'm going to move these things out of the way right now and bring my pattern paper over. And I took the old side band pattern for the buckram and laid it down here, put weights on it, and I traced around it. So then I'm going to take that off now and show you. So here is what we had from before that's on here. Now I already wrote on here fabric side band because we're going to be cutting that out on our fabric and cut one. And what we're going to do is add a 1/2 inch all the way around. Now at the end here, already has a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then, of course, the end at the other end has a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now what we need to do is put a 1/2 inch here and a 1/2 inch there. So I'm going to take my ruler and start putting a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. Finish this off here. And then let's turn it and do the other side. We're doing a seam allowance there. And a seam allowance here. Now at the end, I'm going to join the lines. And right here, I'm going to join the lines. So I'm going to mark it. I marked it in the pattern here, 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that means all the way around it's a 1/2 inch. But I'm going to write in the seam allowance 1/2 inch. And down here too. Now this, when we cut this out on the fabric, we're going to cut this out on the bias. And so I drew the line here for the bias so that I'll know when I lay this down on my fabric that this needs to be cut out on the bias. Okay, that's the side band, and now you can cut that out. Now let me bring over the brim. So I laid the brim down and traced around it. Now remember, when you're tracing around it, to put the tabs down here and mark them, and then you have to go back and make a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. Now when we cut out the fabric, we're not going to want to cut out the middle part. We're going to sew it on the buckram first before we cut out the middle part. Otherwise, where it's on the bias, it will stretch and it'll look funky on your buckram. So that's what we need to do, is to wait till we've sewed that on. Now remember to mark the center front and the center back and the side and the side. And as you start sewing, and you'll see how crucial it is that you know where your center front and your center back is, and then also your seam allowance here. Now what we need to add to our pattern is 1 inch seam allowance on the outside. And what you notice here, that I wrote fabric pattern cut 2. So we need 1 piece of fabric for one side and one piece of fabric for the other side. So now I recommend that you do 1 inch. So you're going to make sure that you have enough fabric. Once you start doing this, you can go down to a 1/2 inch. But just in case, if you have fabric that is really heavy or that ravels, then you would really need to have more than a 1/2 inch. So it's better right now just to do 1 inch. Now, after we finish doing this, you're going to be able to go buy your fabric, and you're going to know exactly how much fabric you're going to need. And as I mentioned to you before, usually it's about 1 yard for a boater hat. But if for any reason it's really expensive fabric and you're on a budget, then this way you can lay it down first and make sure that you buy just what you need. Now, as a rule, when we're doing the brim or the crown, the center front to the center back is always goes on the bias. So you can remember that. It seems weird to be doing it with a felt tip pen, but I'm hoping that it's helping you so that you can see it a lot better with the felt tip pen. And the contrast of the black and the white. So I'm almost all the way around. And as I mentioned before, if you want to true up your seam, your round seam here, so that it looks perfect, you can use the French curve to do that. So if you want to go back, you can make the curve perfect in between here. Now I'm going to mark in the seam allowance 1 inch. And then of course this seam allowance is 1/2. When the seam allowance is the same all over, then I always mark it on the pattern, but if it's different, I'm marking it in the seam allowance here. So you're going to be cutting out 2 pieces of fabric, and of course it's up to you if you want them to be the same, or the one side could be a different fabric from the other side. That's up to you. So now the fabric for the brim is all ready to go, and you can you can cut out the outer edge here. And remember, you're going to cut out 2 pieces of fabric for that one. We have the third piece left, which is the tip. So here's the tip from before that we used. And we have 1 inch seam allowance here. And guess what? We can use the same pattern for the fabric. So what I'm going to, this says buckram tip. Well, we can also put fabric and buckram. And it's better to have 1 inch seam allowance here, as I mentioned with the brim, in case your fabric ravels, or if it's really thick, it'll take up a little bit more room. And so for doing your first one, for sure, if you have more extra fabric, you're going to be really happy. So this is the tip for your fabric, is the tip for your buckram also, and you're going to be ready to cut out your fabric. Now remember, the center front to the center back is going to be on the bias. So I'm going to just do a little bias on here so that you know that you need to lay that down on the bias. Okay, I think we're ready to cut out our fabric. So now you have your pattern, and you can go to the fabric store, take that with you, and get your fabric. Alrighty, let's get started.